Here it is, the beginner's guide to reselling tax. And this video is for you if you're one of the following. You're selling items on Vinted, eBay, or any other online marketplace for a profit. You're using your parents' account to sell on Vinted or eBay because you're under the age of 18. You're selling old items, not for a profit, but you are selling consistently on these platforms. You're thinking of starting the Vinted reselling side hustle. You have a full-time job and are doing reselling on the side. You're a full-time reseller. Now, bearing in mind, I'm not a financial advisor. This is just to bring awareness if you're just starting out on reselling or you've been reselling for a while, but you have no idea how the tax system works in the UK. As I said, people, I'm going to keep this nice and simple for you if you're a complete beginner and don't understand what tax is. If you get flustered watching this, don't worry, you can always re-watch the video. Take your time, especially if you're learning about tax for the first time. Now, don't judge yourself either, because the UK education system do not make it easy for you to understand how tax works. It's definitely not explained well at school, so hopefully this video helps. And if you do find this video helpful, please give this a thumbs up and potentially subscribe. So what is tax, and more importantly, when do you need to start paying tax? So tax is something that you pay on your earnings, and if you've earned over £12,570 in a year, you may have to pay tax. A tax year runs from April to April every single year, which I find strange anyway. Why can't they just do it from January to December? But let me know in the comments why they do it April to April, because I have no idea. So what is the difference between revenue and profit? Revenue is how much something sells for, and profit is how much you've made from selling that item. So a clear example is I've sold a pair of trainers for £90. £90 is the revenue. I bought those trainers for £40. So they sold for 90, 90 minus 40 equals 50. £50 is the profit I've made from that item. So you're taxed on the £50, not the 90. Now, I'm not going to go over VAT in this example, but if you do want a VAT breakdown, you can message it in the comments. I'll potentially do a video on that. So if you made £20,000 in profit, not revenue, from reselling, you would be taxed on the £7,430 you have made. Now, later on in the video, we will explain how business expenses work and how you can offset some of those profits against your business expenses to lower your tax bill. If you've made £1,000 from selling items, whether it's old clothing, and that has reached over £1,000 in 1 year, you need to do something called a self-assessment, which means you have to go on the HMRC's website and register for a self-assessment. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to pay any tax, because remember, you have to earn over £12,570 in profit before you have to pay tax. So if you sold an item for £1,000 that cost you £2,000, you wouldn't have to pay any tax on that item, but you would have to register for a self-assessment, because that's the new law that's been put in place. So what happens if you don't do that self-assessment is now HMRC takes information from the likes of Vinted and eBay automatically, and Vinted and eBay have to automatically send them that information digitally as soon as an account has generated over £1,000 in revenue. That means if you haven't registered for a self-assessment, it'll create a trigger alert on HMRC's system, which means you might get a brown envelope through the door prompting you to create a self-assessment. Even if you sold £15,000 worth of items, that doesn't mean you have to pay any tax. You only pay tax on your profits, not how much something sold for. So if you think you're due for a self-assessment, I have jotted down below the link to HMRC's website or the government's website so you can complete your own self-assessment. It's pretty simple to do, and it's probably better doing it sooner rather than later, because Vinted and eBay are sharing your data anyway, so HMRC pretty much know how much you're selling every single day, and it's probably better to be ahead of the game rather than behind the game, especially if you've been selling online for a while. Now, how can you use business expenses to lower your tax bill? So let's use the example again. You've made £20,000 in profit from reselling in a year. Now remember, the tax-free allowance is £12,570, which means you have to pay tax on the £7,430. But as resellers, you know we have to pay for postage labels, we have to pay for parcel bags, we also have to pay for petrol to go to places. So all of those are business expenses that you can actually use to offset your tax. So let's say you'll be taxed off the profit of £7,430. But in that year, you have spent £500 on packaging supplies and then an extra £500 on travel. Again, I'm just using this as a simple example. That means instead of being taxed on the £7,430 in profit, you're actually being taxed on the £6,430 in profit, because we've managed to offset £1,000 of our tax. Now, you can include your lunch when you're obviously working, and many other things, which is listed on the government's website. Now, what about if you're reselling and you've already got a full-time income? If your income's above the £12,570, and let's say you earn £2,000 in profit in that year, you are liable for tax. But let's say you've got a part-time job and you're only earning £5,000 a year. As long as you don't go over that threshold, you won't be liable for tax. But remember, you could potentially earn more than the threshold and still not have to pay any tax, which we've mentioned in the previous section of this video. So what if you're under the age of 18 and using your parents' account to resell? Well, unfortunately, your parents will be liable to pay for that tax because you're not of age. Everything will be registered in their name. So that means HMRC will think that they're making a side income from something that you're actually doing. So let's say your parents earn £30,000 a year, you're making £5,000 or £10,000 from reselling, even though you personally wouldn't usually be liable because you're under the threshold, because everything's in your parents' name, they'll be liable for that expense. Now, how do you track your business expenses and profits? Well, luckily for you, I've created an automated business expense spreadsheet. You've asked for it, I've created it. The ultimate Vinted and eBay or anywhere reselling spreadsheet. So essentially it will track all your sales. You can change this to January to December if you wanted to, but for tax purposes, I've done April to March. And also what it'll do, it'll track your expenses and profits as a whole, and then monthly as well on this last spreadsheet. All the information that HMRC may want to know, you can put in this spreadsheet, which is another thing. Whether you're just starting out reselling or you've been in the industry for a while, track everything, because it only gets harder the longer that you've been in the game and you haven't picked up good habits when it comes to tracking your inventory and tracking your profits and revenue. Because if you do ever get audited, it will be a nightmare for you, because you need to prove how much something costs you when you're selling on platforms. But I can always go over that part in a separate video if this video does well, explaining what HMRC are actually looking for when you're buying and selling items, what proof you actually have to show, especially when it comes to business expenses. I can also go over VAT once you've reached a certain amount of revenue in a financial year. So now, people, I'm just going to keep it real with you now that the video is coming to an end. I know a lot of you are in between thinking of paying for tax. Should I, shouldn't I? And the honest answer is, if you're taking reselling seriously, even as a side hustle, you should think about registering, because it's just going to delay the process. Now, I get it all the time. Oh, what if I just create new Vinted accounts? Well, when you're withdrawing that money, HMRC have access to your bank accounts if they ever wanted to audit you. So that's not going to change. Yeah, but Willie, what if I just use my Vinted balance to buy and sell? That doesn't make a difference, because if you started off with £100 balance and then that turns into £5,000 and then you eventually decide to withdraw, they can see that too. There's no way around tax, especially as we're becoming more and more digital. You do have that £12,570 cushioning plus business expenses. So even if you earn £30,000 a year, but your business expenses are 16 or 17,000, you're probably going to have to pay a minimal amount of tax. So do keep that in mind. And also, I'm not a financial advisor, so feel free to speak to an accountant. Now, there might be more people clued up here that can give better advice than myself, so feel free to drop it down in the comments. If you've got any questions, I can always answer it in another video. But this is meant to be a super simplified guide to Vinted tax and reselling tax, to make you aware of when you should be paying tax, when you should be registering for a self-assessment, and if you're currently affected. Anyways, I'll catch you in the next one. I'd love it if you subscribed. If you wanted to get into Vinted reselling, I've created the best ebook out there that I've been using for 4 or 5 years, even getting you 50% off items without the buyer even knowing. So check that out if you want to. Catch you in the next one, people.